Welcome everyone to the Great Sources Season 2, Episode 11. Today's shir is titled Choosing Exile, Babylonian Jewry in the Second Temple Era. And that's because what we're going to talk about is what we can learn from the generations that remained in Bavel instead of returning to Eretz Yisrael during the Tkufa of the Bayis Sheni. What does that tell us about when it's appropriate, or at least okay, to not live in Eretz Yisrael? Now, before we get to that, we're going to do as we always do. We're going to review last week's share. Last week we discussed the post-Talmudic era, let's call it, meaning after the Gemara until the modern era, and the fact that during all that time, the people didn't return to Eretz Yisrael as a rule. And we discussed what can that teach us. And as we said, we have to really differentiate between, there are two different elements within that question. One is, why did the masses not go? And the other question is, why did the elite, the tzaddikim and chacham and chasidim, not go individually? So regarding the first question, why did the masses not go, as we discussed, there are 2 points to be made. One is that maybe they were wrong for not going, as Rabbi Levi would have it. And not just they were wrong, maybe that is the worst chait, that's Meinea the Geula. That's exactly how it's spelled out in Sefer Kozri, as we discussed numerous times. So that's one possibility for understanding the masses not returning to Eretz Yisrael. And then possibly it wasn't feasible for them to go back without grave danger, and that would have been exactly what the Shavuos is about. Don't try to take back Eretz Yisrael when it's going to cause a backlash, either in terms of nefashis or economically, socially, they weren't ready, as we discussed at length. And of course, both of these are not exclusive. There are different tkufas where it certainly was impossible for it to be done in a normal, feasible way and a workable way. And there are other tkufas that perhaps they should have done so. That's regarding the masses, the Hamoy not going, as we discussed last week. Okay, so now regarding the other question, once the Hamoy is not going, what about the individuals, the elite? And as we discussed, well, if the Hamoy is not going, that means that Eretz Yisrael is desolate, and the mitzvah is not to be in Eretz Yisrael. The mitzvah is to live in Eretz Yisrael and to have a land that provides you with everything that lands tend to provide: livelihood, society, education. And then if you don't have the tzibur in Eretz Yisrael, then an individual in Eretz Yisrael is not doing the mitzvah. Yeshiva said, so that's not what the mitzvah is. The mitzvah is for it to be our country, and for it to provide us with everything that countries do provide to their people. So once the masses are not going, once there's no tzibur there, again, like we said, we're talking about up to the modern era, let's say up to 100 years ago, we'll call it, or even up to maybe 50 years ago. Once there's no infrastructure and a proper economy, etc., there's no mitzvah even for individuals to go. And those great individuals perhaps chose to stay behind in Chutz La'aretz with the people, with the common people, to teach them Torah and to lead them. So that once the common people aren't going all together, there's no longer a question on, well, what about the tzaddikim and the gedolim and the chachamim that presumably didn't sin in not going back to Eretz Yisrael. So that's what we discussed last week. Now, a listener raised the question, what about the modern era? Aren't there gedolim who didn't go back to Eretz Yisrael, even within the last, let's call it 50 years, when Eretz Yisrael does provide a proper society, economy, etc.? What to make of that? And I want to just address that for a moment. I am not, in these shiurim, going to show you how every chacham, whoever had an opinion about this sugya of Eretz Yisrael, agrees with me. On the contrary, we showed in the beginning that the opinions about this matter run the gamut from strict opposition to strict embrace of complete embrace of Yeshiva Eretz Yisrael as being the center of the Torah, right? So I'm not going to make E11 Divlakim Chayim or somehow show that everyone agrees with me. Certainly not. I'm trying to look for what I believe to be correct. That's what my job is to do, to learn the Torah and see what I think about it, how I think about it. The reason why I cared about the 1500 years of Bnei Yisrael's Haga and their Gedolim is because that tells us something about the Halachim. In other words, if you can conclusively prove to me that, well, for 1500 years, all the Gedolim chose not to go, the Rambam, the Rashba, the Rosh, Rav Hai Goyen, Rav Akiva Eger, etc., etc. And if they had same reasons that we have to go, let's say, if they had the same reasons we should go or could think about going, and they didn't, that teaches us something. But not that would obviously teach us something in terms of halacha, and maybe kaveh halacha. But the fact that they were gedolim in modern era or are gedolim who don't go just proves that their opinion is not true. And I'm sure that it's the case. There's definitely opinions about that. I'm not here to maybe yashiv every opinion of every god. So I hope that's clear. I've only cared to be yashiv that if it was a 1500 years of opinions, of deis, of anhaga, of not going to Eretz Yisrael, that will be something relevant to determining what the halacha is. The individuals who today don't go have their opinions, and imagine, and we have to work out what you could ayin sham, see what they are. We're working out what I think is the correct opinion based on the sugyas. Okay, but so what are we talking about today? So we're going to talk about something very important. Generations, full, complete generations that did not go back to Eretz Yisrael, even when there was a thriving community there, even when there was a Beis HaMikdash there. And that we're talking about now the Bayis Sheni. Bayis Sheni, as we all know, there was the Bayis Rishon Shlomo Melech built, and then it was destroyed, and they went to Babel for 70 years of exile, Golus. Bayis Sheni was rebuilt, and Ezra and Zerubbabel, they made an aliyah, they brought a return to Eretz Yisrael, but not everyone came with them. Many people stayed behind in Babel. And lest you think that the people who stayed behind in Babel were the simple folk, it's actually not the case at all. In fact, it's the opposite of a sense, as we shall see. So I'm going to bring you some of the sources about who stayed behind in Babel, what happened during that period of the Bayis Sheni, those who stayed behind Babel, and what life was like for them. And what we're going to get to then is to figure out, well, why did they stay behind in Babel? Given that there was a thriving community in Exile with a Beis HaMikdash, what justified then for great communities to stay behind in Babel instead of joining the redemption God, right? Which was a redemption to some extent in Eretz Yisrael and the building of the Beis HaMikdash, and what that can teach us, if anything, for today. Okay, that's our work for now. So let me give you the background, the sources. So we have if you have the source sheet in front of you, the first thing is the Medrash Tanchuma says, this is really Gemara getting to, but the Medrash Tanchuma adds to it, that before there were two waves of exile, of Golus, from as you saw, and the Bayis Rishon. There was the Golus of Yechonyo, when Yechonyo was the king. He went to Golus, and along with him went the Chorosh and the Masker, the pasuk says. Malachim, the Chorosh and the Masker means the elite Chachamim. And they were sent to Golus, meaning they were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, 11 years, I think it's 11 years, before the final Golus that went out to Golus with Tzidkiyahu HaMelech. So first it was Yechonyo HaMelech, he was exiled along with the elite, the Chorosh and the Masker, and then 11 years later was Tzidkiyahu with the Hamlainam, with the simple folk. So what the Medrash says is that the Chorosh and Masker, the elite, the Chacham that went with Yechonyo early, they established Torah in Babel, and, says the Tanchuma, written hundreds and hundreds of years later, says the Tanchuma, they stayed in Babel with their Torah, min oisa shah ad hayom, from that time until today. Tanchuma there, as we shall see later, is talking about the two yeshivas in Babel. The two yeshivas are Sura and Harda, the two great yeshivas in Babel for hundreds of years. And it's saying, look, when this started, this thing of having Torah in Babel, started way back in the prior even to the Churban Bayis Rishon, because Yechonyo, who was exiled along with the Chorosh and the Masker, with the elite Chachmei Yisrael, established Torah in Babel, where they remained, the Torah remained in Babel until this very day, unbroken chain. So we learn from that the Chachamim stayed behind in Babel. Rashi in Sukkah says, as I mentioned, that the Charash and the Maskir went with Yechanya, and that wisdom stayed with them till the Gemara over there is Rabbi Yochanan speaking. So the Torah was not forgotten in Babel from the end of Bayis Rishon. That means they were Chachamim. We're talking about doing Tkufas HaMishnah. In other words, to think about this, when we learn Mishnayos and we have Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Kiva and Bisham and Basil, these are all Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael. But at the same time that there was this great Chacham of the Mishnah was being put together in Eretz Yisrael, at that same time, and throughout those hundreds of 420 years of Bayis Sheni, throughout the 420 years of Bayis Sheni, there were at the same time always Chachamim and Torah in Bavel. Interestingly, they're anonymous. We never heard of them. In other words, who were the Chachamim in Bavel? When Rabbi Yehuda, when Rabbi Kiva, when Hillel was active in Eretz Yisrael, who was the people in Bavel? And how could we never heard of them is a question. But the fact is, there were Chachamim there, on a par or perhaps surpassing, as we shall see. Some of the Chachamim Eretz Yisrael, and they were there consecutively from the Golus prior to the Churban Bayis Rishon, throughout the Bayis Sheni and afterwards. Okay, so these are Torah Chachamei Bavel who didn't return and go with Bayis Sheni. The Ramban in the Mechamas and Ksubas says also the Iker Torah was in Naharda, and the Iker Torah from the days of Golus was there in Naharda. The Sefer HaIkrim says a really interesting thing. This is also there. You can follow along in the sources up to number 4. The Sefer HaIkrim says that when Ezra came back from Bavel, only some few people returned with him. And he says the following. Whatever his agenda is over there, he's talking about proving that the Torah could not have been falsified. So he says like this. He says, the Gedolim Shav Yisrael and the Chachamim and the Miuchasim, Kulam Nishru B'Bavel. Kulam Nishru B'Bavel. All the Gedolim and all the Chachamim and all the Miuchasim stayed in Bavel. Amazing thing. And he says, since in Bavel, so he's coming to prove Ezra couldn't have changed anything. I think that's the agenda there. Some people say Ezra changed it. Can't be. Why? Because all the Gedolim and Yodei Torah were where? When the Bayis Sheni was being built in Eretz Yisrael, you don't know where were all the Gedolim and the Chacham? In Bavel. And can Sefer HaIkrim. All the Chacham and Gedolim Torah were in Bavel. Wow. So they didn't come back. 70 years of Bavel, right? Yirmiyah said there's going to be 70 years of God's Bavel. The Filim Ma'aseh Bavel Shim Shana Efkod Eschem Amarsha. And the Gedolim and the Chachamim said we're staying behind. Now, parenthetically, one more source for this is the Kozri. We spoke about this Kozri numerous times. The Kozri Mayim Beis Simchav Dalet says everyone should have come back, and had everyone all come back, the Shechina would have returned. Says Rabbi Yehuda Levi. Instead, only some of them came back. Rubam v'hanechbodim, most of them, and the nechbodim, the let's go powerful ones, or the upper strata of society. Noisru b'Bavel, stayed behind the Bavel. So I think it's significant that while the Sefer HaIkrim calls the ones who stayed behind, he says they were the Chachamim and the Gedolim. Yehuda Levi calls them the aristocracy, the Nechbadim, but not the Chachamim, not the Gedolim. That's because Yehuda Levi holds, as he says in that very paragraph. He says, had they all returned, the Shechina would have come back. So they may have been great Lamdanim. But if actually the Shechina would have returned, had they come back, then they made the single greatest, perhaps one of the single greatest Torah errors in history, by not coming back, or by thinking that they don't have to come back, because had they come back, the Shechina would return. So therefore, Yehuda Levi doesn't call them Chachamim. Now, to be clear, and this is what we're going to be exploring, to be clear, they obviously hold, the Chachamim, the Gedolim that stayed behind, obviously held, that even if they come back, the Shechina won't return. Otherwise, they would have come back. We'll see exactly why they stayed behind. Yehuda Levi is saying that the Shechina would have come back had they returned, and therefore, like I said, he doesn't call them Chacham. Now, this point that, had Babylonian Jewry returned to Eretz Yisrael, had all the Yidden come back with Ezra instead of only a fraction, Had they all come back, would the Shekhinah have come to the Bayis Sheni or not? So this is actually a machlokes in Yuma Daf Tes. Shlakish was swimming in the yard, and says the Gemara, and along came Rabbi Bachana. Rabbi Bachana was from Eretz Yisrael, from Babylon, and he came to Eretz Yisrael. And Rabbi Bachana gave a hand to Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish wouldn't take his hand. He said, "By God, I hate you, the Babylonians." Belaka sanina lechu. Why do I hate you, Babylonians? That he wouldn't even give them his hand. Because, and he dashes a pasuk in Shir Shirim, had you all come back when Ezra, B'nai Ezra, when Ezra came and turned to Etzol, had you all come with him, the Shekhinah would have dwelled in the Bayis Sheni. And because he says, as it says in Zechariah, why didn't it happen? Why didn't it happen? Says Rish Lakish, because the Babylonians didn't all return. So I don't want to take your hand even. He hated them. Not interested in associating with the Bavli. And then he came to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, actually, even if everyone would have returned, all the Babylonians, all the Yadus Bavel, even if they would have all come back and made the ascent, made the return to Israel, still, says Rabbi Yochanan, the Shekhinah wouldn't dwell in the Bayis Sheni. And that's because the Bayis Sheni was built under the auspices of Koresh, king of Paras. And the pasuk says, "Yafta lekim leyafes v'yishkin ba'ohalei Shem." Hashem only dwells in a house built by someone descended from Shem, like Shlomo HaMelech. Yefes is descended from. Koresh Persians are descended from Yefes. So Hashem won't dwell in a house built by a Persian. So basically, what's Rabbi Yochanan saying? He says to Rish Lakish, you who hated the Bavliim, you won't even give your hand to Rabbi Bachana because it's all the Bavli's fault. Is that the Bayis Sheni didn't live up to its expectations of Hashras HaShechina. It's all the Bavliim's fault. If they would have come back, then the Shechina would have been Shaira, and therefore you hate the Bavliim. Says Rabbi Yochanan, not true. Actually, it wouldn't have helped had all the Bavliim come back. They would have, the Shekhinah still wouldn't have dwelt. Okay? Now, here's the thing. So, just to back to the Kuzri for a moment. The Kuzri, and this is there, we mentioned this numerous times, this is Maimer Beis L'Chavdala, and it's there, we're up to 7 now in the source sheet. So the Kuzri says that it's this chait of us not embracing and returning to Israel, which is what was Meneh, which was what stopped the Shekhinah from dwelling in the Bayis Sheni. And the king accused him, how come you people aren't making Israel your home? And he said, you're right, you got me. This is the chait. So that's why I said earlier, that's why the Kuzri doesn't call those who stayed behind Chachamim, because they did one of the single greatest errors in Jewish history, Jewish religious history, of not going back to Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Kuzri is clearly basically saying like Rish Lakish, right? He says this chait was menea, the Shekhinah returns. That's like Rish Lakish. Well, why is he going like Rish Lakish, not like Rabbi Yochanan? That was like Rabbi Yochanan. And what exactly is the machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish about? The Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold it to Kuzri. This is something we're going to get to another time. But for now, I just want to point out something that once we're on the topic here. So we're talking about the Chachmei Bavel, or the Jews in Bavel, which again, Rish Lakish says, I'm so angry at them, I won't even take a hand proffered to me by someone from Bavel, because the Bavliim, it's their fault that the Shun didn't return. And Rabbi Yochanan says, actually, it's not so bad, the Shekhinah wouldn't have returned anyways. But I want to make it clear, Rabbi Yochanan also did not have an affinity for the Bavliim. That's the Medrash in Shir Shirim says, Rabbi Yochanan, when he would see a Bavli, that's all, he wouldn't even counter them. He would bother them and annoy them, because he says the Navi's would counter them. He brings a pasuk. The pasuk says that God is the Mayas, the Bavliim, or those that didn't return. So Rabbi Yochanan says only that even if they would have returned to Eretz Yisrael, even if they would have returned to Eretz Yisrael, still the Shekhinah wouldn't have come back. But not that Rabbi Yochanan holds that the Bavliim are okay. Rabbi Yochanan also has problems with the Bavliim that they should have returned. He believes that all the Bavliim should have returned to Eretz Yisrael and being Bayis Sheni. He just says they should have all returned because it was a Pekida, because the Bayis was being built, because of living there itself, whatever reason. But what he disputes is that had they returned, the Shekhinah would have come back. That's what he doesn't. That's what Rabbi Yochanan disputes Rish Lakish about. Now, this, by the way, is something that it says in V'yom Moshe, but it's an error. In V'yom Moshe, he's talking about the following question. The Pnei Yeshua in Ksubis talks about why the Babylonian didn't return. Why, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. He talks about it today. The Pnei Yeshua actually talks about it from a little bit of a different angle. Pnei Yeshua says, why didn't they, all the people in Babel, why didn't they return? So the Pnei Yeshua gives a limud schos, ayin sham, it's the end of Ksubis. We don't have to talk about it now, it's not negated to our discussion. And the Pnei Yeshua says, even though Rish Lakish in Yuma hates the Babylonian for not returning, says the Pnei Yeshua, okay, it's Agadas Chalukis, it's okay, I could suggest, says the Pnei Yeshua, that not everyone agrees to Rish Lakish in this regard. Okay, that's the Pnei Yeshua. So, Satmar says, I don't understand, why did he quote Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi Yochanan argues right there, Chiddush. Why doesn't the Pnei Yeshua bring that? Rabbi Yochanan argues Rish Lakish right there, but the answer is it's wrong. Rabbi Yochanan just argues on one nekuda. At one point, he says the Shekhinah wouldn't have come back even if the Jews would have all returned from Babel. But the hatred to the Babylonian is something that Rabbi Yochanan shares with Rish Lakish, as we see in